Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us for our annual federal update. My name is Jackie VanDerMeulen. I'm going to introduce our speakers in a moment, but first wanted to welcome all of you from coast to coast. I guess good morning to those on the West Coast and good afternoon to those on the East Coast. And I'll just say hi to everyone in between. So while I introduce the speakers, if we could go to the next slide, just a few housekeeping items for you to take note of, please. And more than anything, I'd like to point your attention to the survey feature. We really value your feedback, both on this presentation and also with different ideas about other topics that we can be covering. So please take a moment after this presentation is over to fill out our survey. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you. So first, as I said, my name's Jackie. I'm a partner here in the Labor and Employment Group in Toronto, and I am joined by a few of my colleagues. But first, I'll introduce our special guest, Derrick Hynes, who is the CEO and president of FETCO, one of the largest, most prominent employer organizations operating in the federal sector. Derrick probably needs no introduction because I think he's a very well-known entity at this stage amongst federal employers. But Derrick's going to share some of his insights, what he's seeing with a lot of you, but also what he's hearing on the Hill, so to speak. And we are joined by, I'll start first with Stéphane Fillion, who is one of the co-leaders of the Labor and Employment Group here at Fasken. He's a partner based in the Montreal office. I've also got my colleague, Pigott, a partner in our Labor and Employment Group here in Toronto. Gascho is going to join us in a moment as well. He is a pension lawyer based here in Toronto because we've got some pension updates for you throughout the course of the presentation. So with that, I will jump right into it because we've got an action-packed agenda today. There's lots going on in the federal sector, as seems to be the case every year, but particularly with this government, and likely because of the supply and confidence agreement between the NDP and the Liberals. We're seeing a lot of legislative changes going on. So we're going to go through the most recent one being the proposed ban on replacement workers. We'll start off with that, go through some of the other things that have been in place for a while, but now are really having big impacts on employers, like pay equity with the looming deadlines, most recent pay transparency changes. Chris is going to talk to us a little bit about paid medical leave and what we're seeing playing out in the case law and through employers in the federal sector. As well, the Modern Slavery Act, which we know is on the agenda. I'll touch a little bit on accessibility and then wrap it up with pensions. So we'll start off with, I'll turn it over to you, Stéphane, to talk about the proposed replacement worker ban.
Thank you very much, Jackie. So let's start with a burning subject that's been on everybody's radar since, actually the last fall or even or maybe last January. So the proposed replacement worker ban. So some of you, as Jackie was mentioning, might remember that this was part of the so-called supply and confidence agreement that was reached in March 2022 between the Liberal and the NDP. So to introduce by the end of October, at the end of 2003, this prohibition. In October 2022, so if you can switch slide, the federal labor minister announced a consultation on the subject, but it also included a consultation on what I typically call the essential service or the maintenance of activities, which is a term we use more in the federal jurisdiction. Some of you might remember that the consultation was to end around the end of January 2023. We commented last year at the same presentation that it already looked like a done deal, and when the consultation took place, this was really the feeling I had when I was reading all of the questions and the end. It was almost like we wanted to have the better of the BC world and the Quebec world melted together, so to have a clear and complete protection. We'll see, where it leads us. So anyway, I just wanted, because I couldn't avoid making some comments like that after this consultation took place, some of you might remember that there was a strike of the Public Service Alliance of Canada that took place in April 2023. So it was kind of funny to see the government telling employees that they could avoid being on strike by working remotely, and then putting into place a replacement worker ban. So I kind kind of I kind of laughed when I saw that. But I guess it's all fair. The law was not implemented yet, so that's why they probably did it. So anyway, so I'm getting out of line. Let's go back to our presentation. As Jackie was mentioning, we have a lot of stuff. So on November 9th, the government introduced Bill C-58 to amend the Canada Labour Code. We're going to dig into it a bit further, but in short, if it was enacted, it would impose a broad prohibition on the use of replacement workers and also make a significant change to the maintenance of activities process, which I call the essential services earlier on. So next slide. So what is proposed? So the following individuals, and we have the list here in front of you, would not be permitted to perform bargaining work during a strike or lockout, which is, I underlined, if hired after notice to bargain was given, because you'll see this is an important aspect to remember. So any employee, including non-union employees, any person who performs management functions, any employee, there's a missing word, sorry for that, any employee employed in a confidential capacity related to labor relations, any contractor other than a dependent contractor, and also any employee of another employer. We're referencing here agency workers as an example. So just for those of you who haven't seen the draft bill, essentially the first three are included in one specific paragraph, and then the last two are in a different one, which has an important impact. Before we move on to the next slide, I want you to notice two important things in my view. First, there is no notion, for those who are familiar with the rules applicable in Quebec, about, in the establishment or any reference to it. There is nothing like that. It's actually closer to what we have in BC than what we have in Quebec when it gets to that. So it's broader in that sense that it could apply if the work was being done elsewhere. Although, some might argue that in the federal jurisdiction, most, if not all, of the work is, kind of difficult to do in another location. As an example, you can't really do the work in port terminals to another port terminals. But anyway, so that's part of it. The second part of it, which is also different from what we have in Quebec, as an example, is that, if you read it carefully, you'll see that it's not limited to managers. It includes, in other words, work could be done by an employee who is not part of the bargaining unit, but who is not a manager, as long as the person has been hired before notice to bargain was given. So I think that's another important distinction, if for those of you who are familiar with the Quebec rules, in that, for example, an office employee who is not part of the bargaining unit could do work during a strike or lockout as long as the person was hired before the notice to bargain was given. So now we can switch to the next slide. So I wanted to come back to the second portion that I was mentioning before. So contractor or personal agency or employees of another employer. So there is a specific exception in the Act, which will basically allow employer to continue to use contractors or even personal agency or employees of another employer, as long as they do so during the strike or lockout in the same manner, to the same extent and in the same circumstances as they did before. So in other words, employers would not be allowed to replace the employees by contractors. However, if a contractor was already performing services, the contractor could continue to do the same services he was providing before the notice to bargain was sent. Given how the Bill C-58 is drafted, there was a need to add another specific limitation on the use of employees who are part of the bargaining unit. So just to go back to what the government did in April 2023, that would no longer be allowed because employees in the bargaining unit cannot work remotely or not remotely during a strike or lockout. There is an exception, as we often find in these types of documents, which relates to situation that present or could reasonably be expected to present an imminent or serious threat to the life, health, and safety, and so on. But obviously, it's always been interpreted very restrictively. And also, there's another limitation that is only if the employer is unable to do so by any other means. So, in other words, the employer would have to start by trying to use the employees who are not in the bargaining unit, who are allowed to work, before asking employees in the bargaining unit to do it, or using a contractor. So let's skip to the next slide. So penalty, pretty severe. So up to $100,000 per day, which is substantial, much more substantial than what we've typically been used to in provincial jurisdiction, for example, in Quebec, which the amounts have been fairly limited. That being said, in most cases, the right recourse is not really for a penalty, because this is much more complicated. Typically, unions will go instead for some kind of a safeguard order or an injunction, despite the amounts, which could be substantial. So one of the important questions that I got asked very frequently, even before the bill was filed, was when could this be coming into force? In the Act, it says 18 months after royal assent, which doesn't tell us very much. I was wondering, Derrick, at this point, if you had heard anything about how fast the government intends to move this on.
Yeah, Stéphane, they're not really being totally clear in this regard. I mean, the bill still needs to go through a lengthy parliamentary process. It's currently only at first reading in the House of Commons. It will still need to go through second reading through the committee review process, in which we will be very active. And then we'll need to come out the other end, get voted, and then pass through the Senate. It's at that point when it will receive royal assent. It's not clear how long that entire process is going to take, how motivated the government is to get there. It is clear they're getting a lot of pressure from proponents of the bill, particularly within the NDP and within the labor movement, to accelerate this quickly. But we really don't know at this point how fast it's going to advance. What we're doing on the employer side is preparing in the event that it does advance quickly to make our arguments against this bill.
Thank you, Derrick. So, and it kind of goes in the same vein of, when I was reading the Bill C-58, I kind of felt like this was kind of unfinished work. And I think we'll have to be very careful into what it will evolve to. Will the government try to broaden it before it gets adopted or something like that? I think that's something to be very concerned about. So assuming it remains the same way, so transitional provision. So all employers should be aware that, according to Bill C-58, the section would come into force in respect of any strike or lockout that is ongoing on that day. So that's also important, because for various purposes, we reviewed how it worked in BC when the prohibition was enacted, and what they actually did at the time was that it was only applicable for future bargaining process, but that's not what they're saying in this one. It would apply to any strike that is ongoing on the date when it comes into force. So you have, in other words, 18 months to prepare yourself for that, but don't expect that you're going to be able to avoid the application if it comes into force by that time. So next subject that we're going to cover, because it's also important for anyone in the federal sector who has been involved in the maintenance of activities process. So it's pretty clear when you're reading this section that I don't know if the representations came from the CIRB or from unions, or where it came from, but it's pretty clear that the government wanted to limit how long it could take to establish, whatever maintenance of activities needed to be agreed upon. Some of you might know that in some particular instances, it could take months, if not years, before we could get a decision from the CIRB. And while the decision had not been rendered, obviously no strike or lockout could take place. So it's pretty clear that they wanted to address that issue. So first thing they did is establish a requirement requirement that a union employer must enter into a maintenance of activities agreement within 15 days of getting notice to bargain. It's important to note that that Bill C-58 mentions that it includes an agreement that no activities need to be maintained. So in other words, it's not just establishing those that need to be maintained, but also confirming if nothing needs to be maintained. I skipped, you won't see it in the presentation, but there's always the right of the labor minister to ask the CIRB to either review the agreement or to address specific aspects if needed. So anyway, so if the parties do not reach an agreement, then the CIRB must, on application by the parties or by the minister, determine maintenance of activities. And the CIRB will have no later than 90 days after receiving the application or referral, the decision needs to be rendered, which we can all agree is pretty limited compared to what we've been used to in front of the CIRB. And in order to do that, there's some added powers in Bill C-58. So two things. The board would have the power to make any order. This is a modification to Section 16, which takes all of the powers of the board. So that's another that's been added. So make any order and give any direction that it considers appropriate for the purpose of expediting proceedings or preventing an abusive process. We all know, that this when you're in front of the CIRB, you never exactly know how this will be used, but sometimes it could be pretty extreme in terms of the nature of the measures that could be taken. They also added in another section of Bill C-58 that the board has the ability to exercise any of its powers for the purpose of ensuring that it complies with the time limit. So I'm probably expecting that there's going to be a lot being done on paper and in responses, and probably some hearings will be avoided by the CIRB in order to reach to reach the 90 days delay. So next slide.
Stéphane, when I'm thinking about all this work, I mean, as it is, we're seeing the CIRB being overwhelmed with cases and significant delay. I mean, I know that they've got at least 18 months to sort of hire up at the CIRB, but I'm a little bit concerned about where they're going to find qualified folks and in sufficient volume to address this, because if every single employer now who's going into bargaining has got to agree to one of these agreements, it seems to me that we're going to be bogged down significantly. I
agree, and this is not a topic of this specific presentation, but there's for those who are interested, there's a specific paragraph that's been added. I haven't made a complete analysis, but that allows the board to send stuff to arbitrators. So I'm kind of guessing that they will take some of the recourses because they've added powers on a lot of different recourses that will probably see the board start to send some of the other, because I don't see them sending this to arbitrators, but I can see them sending other stuff to arbitrators just to, because they have a hard time. Just very recently, we were waiting for a decision of the board. It took, more than a year and a half to get a decision on something that was fairly easy, just a health and safety thing. So it should have been, pretty, just an appeal from a Labor Canada decision. So if that takes 18 months, you can imagine how can they do it in 90 days. I'm having recourses right now in front of the board, and they're already, in a position where they already know they're not going to be able to do it, and they're trying to go through mediation and find a way to avoid going to hearings. But I think that's just there are still words in Bill C-58 that will say things like as much as possible or to the extent possible. I'm kind of thinking that this might be used more often than we think. Okay, so next one, the criteria. The reason why I wanted to make a specific mention to this is, when I was looking at the consultation, I thought maybe this could be a good idea where they could decide not to do it all for unions, but also to include something for employers and for the country in general. And one of the things that I was counting on is that maybe they could look at the criteria and not just leave it at immediate and serious danger to the safety and health of the public, especially because for most federal employers, every time there's a strike or a lockout, it's the whole supply chain in Canada that is being affected. It has a huge impact on the economy. So I was thinking maybe the government will look into this and maybe they will, include something else and say that, we have to take the country's best interest that's, in consideration. And maybe we cannot just jam, for example, port terminals or airports or stuff like that. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And, although I suspect that maybe the bill will change, I'm not thinking, and maybe Derrick later on, you can comment on this, but I'm not really expecting that this will be modified. So moving on to the next one. So obviously strike or lockout cannot be, just go back for 1 second. So strike or lockout notice cannot be sent until there's an agreement entered into a decision. So that's not much different from what we have. We had previously, in terms of transitional provisions, in that particular case, it would apply in respect of collective bargaining if the notice to bargain collectively is given on or after the day on which the sections come into force. So in other words, they didn't take the same approach as with the replacement worker provision. This would only apply to future collective bargaining. So that pretty much covers it. I don't know if, Derrick, you have some comments on this section before we move on.
Well, I could take the next hour if you want, but maybe I'll try and say them in 3 minutes or less. I mean, this is such a frustrating file on behalf of the employer community. It's a red line issue for us. We crossed this bridge many years ago where we all agreed this system is largely balanced, and doing this would upset that balance. So in many respects, a replacement worker ban in the federal private sector is a solution looking for a problem to solve. And I do concur with your comments about consultation. The government did hold some meetings on this, but they really weren't consultation. It was like asking me what I want for dinner when it's already in the oven and fully baked. I mean, the solution was already decided before we had these meetings. And just to give you some political history, I mean, this issue has come up a dozen times in the past 20 years, usually through private members' bills brought forward by the Bloc Québécois or the NDP. And Liberals and Conservatives have en masse voted against this every single time. There are, in fact, 100 current Liberal MPs who in the past few years have voted no to replacement worker bans twice, including the current Minister of Labour. This is a government that prides itself in its speaking points on doing evidence-based analysis before they introduce government policy. All of the evidence that we can find points to the fact that this is not a good idea. Replacement worker bans result in more strikes, longer strikes, more instability in the supply chain, as you noted, Stéphane. In fact, in the longer term, reduced investment and lower wages for workers. There's nothing about this from our perspective that is good. I understand why the unions want it, because it gives them more leverage at the bargaining table. The Globe and Mail reported this week that this is clearly being done for, quote, naked partisan political purposes. So for us, very frustrating file. We don't think the fight's over. We'll be very active on this file as it proceeds through the parliamentary process. We are worried that the proponents of this bill will come and ask for more. So we will certainly be very active. And I will refer back to your maintenance of activities slides. I think the government did this because they believed it would be a counterbalance to the changes they were introducing to introduce a replacement worker ban. I think you will agree based on your comments that that is not what they have achieved here. They've largely incentivized people to go through this maintenance of activities process, which is just going to be a gong show from the Labour Board perspective. And I don't think is going to actually give us any more stability at the bargaining table. So yeah, frustrating file. And we're still going to be very active on it, representing the members that we represent in the employer community.
Thanks, Derrick.
Yeah, lots more to come, I'm sure. Turning to pay equity. So we've only got a year left, and not even a year left at this stage. It's time is ticking away quickly. And I think what most employers are finding is that this process is a lot more work than they anticipated. So the deadline obviously is September 3rd, 2024 to have your first pay equity plan posted for the vast majority of employers. you've got to back out of that, of course, the 60-day posting window in advance. What we're finding for most employers now who are required to have a committee, so those with 100 or more employees or those who have unions, is that they're getting started in their committee work. Although, again, some are still sort of just getting to that stage now. Again, just because of the sheer amount of work that has to be done in terms of collecting data and making sure that data is clean before you even get to the committee table. There was a lot of interest from employers about multiple plans. I won't go into all of those decisions just given the amount of time we've had, but I think the clear message from the Pay Equity Commissioner has been that multiple plans will only be granted where they promote pay equity, which is obviously a very high bar and challenging to establish. So even though the Act has this dual purpose of promoting pay equity, essentially, it also recognizes the unique needs of employers. That part of the purpose of the Act has really fallen by the wayside. And it's much more of a focus on ensuring that anything that the Commission approves goes not just sort of as neutral to pay equity, but actually advances pay equity. So we've only really seen that CN case where that was the first one to come out. They got a plan for one of their pension investment folks. And since then, we've really seen the Commission coming out against multiple plans, although we do know that there are still a few in the works. So we're cautiously optimistic that we may actually see some of those progress and be granted, but a challenging one. We've seen a few employers also try and use the group of employers provisions under the Act, where you can have different employers come together and collectively do a pay equity plan that they then individually apply to their workforces. But even the circumstances where that can be applied are still fairly narrow. So, for example, you can't just apply it to part of your workforce. In the case where, for example, you might bargain collectively with a group of employers for part of your workforce, but not your whole workforce. I've made inquiries with the Commission about that. And they've been very clear that no, you can't sort of segment off part of it. So it's a pretty limited utility. On the next slide, so what are we seeing the kind of big issues right now in committee for most employers? Terms of reference was one of the ones that should be relatively easy to establish, but was actually causing a lot of challenges for employers. So what some employers have done is actually just said, we're not using terms of reference at all. I would say, particularly in the unionized environment. In the non-unionized environment, it's fairly standard. Things move easily on this front, but unions are using the negotiation around committee terms of reference to try and get all sorts of other concessions. So a lot of employers are just saying, we're not going to do it at all, and we'll just figure this out as we go, which is perfectly okay too. The job evaluation tool is one where, again, in unionized environments in particular, employers are having a lot of challenges. If you go on Cavaluso's website, Cavaluso is a large, prominent union side labor firm. They've published a pay equity guide for unions. And if you have a few hours, it's an interesting read. There's a lot of really good information in there, but one of the key things that I took away from it was that they were very much encouraging all the unions to push back on any off-the-shelf job evaluation tool. So they are sort of advocating for requiring employers to develop a customized tool in the Pay Equity Committee, which is extremely time-consuming and challenging, obviously, for the employers too. So we're seeing a lot of fights happen there. Right now, what I'm seeing at least is most of it is being dealt with through negotiations or discussions at this stage, but we will certainly see some of these issues be referred to the Commissioner for decisions in the coming, I would expect a year and a half. We'll start seeing some case law emerge on that front. The exclusions from compensation are also a challenging area. Again, there's a lot to be debated there, particularly again in unionized committees. In non-unionized workplaces, the employer obviously has the advantage of sort of being able to present its own analysis, because a lot of employers have spent a lot of time really looking in and digging into these issues and coming to their committees with sort of thoughtful presentations of how they actually be applied. In the unionized context, there are a lot more challenges at stake. The methodology is one, and I'll just flag this quickly for folks, that right now in Quebec, in the pay equity process in Quebec, there's actually a really interesting debate playing out around the methodologies to be used. And Quebec's legislation is different. The methodologies required are different. but there's still a lot of, I would say, academic debate amongst experts about the appropriate methodologies. You probably know under the Federal Pay Equity Act, there are 2 prescribed methodologies, but there is an opportunity either on application to the commissioner if you don't have a committee, or if you do have a committee where the committee deems that the 2 prescribed methods can't be used, to apply an alternate method. So a lot of employers are exploring that right now. And if you're doing that, I would again just encourage you to take a look at what's happening in Quebec, because there's some interesting options that are being presented and debated. And I don't think we've seen the end of that debate in Quebec either, but it's currently evolving. On the implementation of wage gaps, a lot of employers that I'm working with are looking ahead and saying, okay, we anticipate we may have gaps in our final pay equity plan. How are we going to correct those gaps? And unfortunately, there's very little guidance at this stage for what the options are, other than that the Act does sort of define compensation very broadly, and it refers to increases in compensation. The other thing is that there were new regulations just released in draft form last Friday, and they seem to suggest as well that there is an opportunity for employers to play not just with straight wage adjustments, so not just we're going to pay employees $2 more an hour on their hourly wage, but also to play with benefit entitlements and access to pension plans, access to bonuses, those sorts of things. So I'm hopeful that there'll be some flexibility there for employers, because depending on what the gap is being driven by, you may want to vary the sort of tool that's used to close the gap. But I've made inquiries with the Commission on this, and they've sort of said, basically, they've got their hands full right now with sort of getting us to the September 3rd deadline. So I'm hopeful that we'll see more guidance from them on this in the near term, but we don't have it yet, unfortunately. If we turn to the next slide, so what happens if you miss the deadline? And unfortunately, I think a lot of employers are going to be in this position. Again, this is the sort of work that takes a long time because it's got to be done in committee. There are a lot of issues and debates that can come up, particularly if you don't have an existing job evaluation tool and a job evaluation scores that you can use for this exercise, or that your committee decides you can use for this exercise. Employers could be doing this for another couple of years, even if they're prioritizing it and doing it as quickly as they can, just given the number of jobs that a lot of you have in your workplaces. So we're anticipating that if you're going to meet if you're not going to meet the September 3rd deadline, you won't be alone. There is an opportunity to apply under the Act for an extension to the Commissioner. And if you're anticipating that you might be in that position, I would just encourage you to start keeping records now of all of your evidence that you would put in support of how you could show the Commissioner that you have been trying to meet this deadline, you have been working on it, but whether it's issues that have come up in the committee or other challenges that you haven't been able to do the work as quickly as you wanted to. So we'll see more on that certainly to come. In terms of timing for applying for that extension, it's going to depend again on your various circumstances, but I would encourage you to have that evidence ready before you even think about applying. So if we turn to the next slide, I mentioned before those new draft regulations, so they were just released on Friday. Some of the issues addressed are really niche. So it's about, for example, methodologies and more details around the methodologies that you can use if there are no male job classes, or if you're using a comparator rate from. Most of those won't apply for the vast majority of employers. However, the two that I think are of most interest to employers relate to the reporting form. So we already knew from the prior regulations that employers were going to have to report on their pay equity compliance by June 2025. So you'll finish your first pay equity plan, ideally in 2024, September, and then by the next spring, employers will have to report on their compliance with those obligations. And there was already significant information that was going to be included in that report. So you don't actually submit your pay equity plan itself to the Commission. as part of this process. But what you're doing instead is listing, for example, the number of female job classes that were entitled to an increase, more demographic information about your organization. So they've now supplemented that list with additional information, really designed to help the commissioner understand sort of what's the scale of these adjustments, how many people are actually getting it, and how are they being implemented. So you'll remember before I talked about implementation and different options, it's clear that now you've got to report the differences. Where did you increase the hourly rate versus where did you, for example, equalize benefits across the group of folks? The other thing that I thought would be of interest to a lot of employers is that the regulations give a lot more meat around the administrative monetary penalty scheme. So it's not an easy scheme to understand, and I won't cover it just given the amount of time we've got, but at a really high level, it's got different sort of scales depending on the size of employer and also the nature of the offense. And so whether it's minor, serious, or very serious. And then also it takes into account, there's a kind of point scale that takes into account the employer's attempts to try and rectify and make right on the situation. So there's a whole chart that outlines the various options. But as you can anticipate, the larger you are as an employer, the higher those penalties, the more serious, the higher the penalties. So, and they go up to $50,000. And that's technically on a daily basis. Again, we anticipate the purpose of this whole legislation is to promote compliance, not to throw or hit people with fines and penalties. But those tools do exist if compliance isn't otherwise being achieved, as is kind of the classic naming and shaming. So posting the employer's name on its website. Derrick, before I move on to the employment equity pay transparency, do you want to jump in and give us a sense of what you're hearing from your members?
Yeah, sure, Jackie. I mean, the multiple plan piece is something I hear a lot about. I mean, as you correctly noted, the legislation makes one plan the default position, while there is a provision that gives the commissioner latitude to allow more than one plan. One plan is the default. Interestingly, the proactive pay equity model that this legislation is built on, dates back a number of years to a study and a report that was done by a person named Professor Bilson. And even she contemplated in her report that there would be organizations where there was enough complexity that perhaps multiple plans would make the most sense. So it is very surprising, I think, to the employer community that none of these applications have yet been approved. And you note you're cautiously optimistic. I'd say I'm not that optimistic, primarily because the Treasury Board application did not get approved, and I found that to be staggeringly surprising. This is a large, complex organization. If you couldn't find enough male comparators to segregate that organization into a smaller group of plans, then I don't know where you would find that. So that's not so great. And I think what employers are finding a little bit frustrating is the lack of clarity at the front end of this process for what the criteria would be for a successful multiple plan application. And there is a sense I'm hearing from employers that it's almost like the rules of the game are changing as we go along. Every time they release another decision, there's a new layer of complexity in their analysis that didn't exist in a previous decision. And that is troubling. I think a number of employers have decided, well, forget it. We don't have time to go through this process to get an unsuccessful decision. So they've just reverted back to trying to figure this out in a single plan. And on the deadlines piece, I think you're bang on. It's a real concern there. The deadline for posting your plan, your final plan, is next September, but it actually has to be shared with employees. I think it's 60 working days before that date. So you build that window in, and then some time for you to make any adjustments after employees might provide comment after those 60 days. Then the reality is most employers probably need to have their plans done by the spring, which I would bet a lot of money is not going to happen in most situations. So your advice around thinking about applying for an extension is wise. They will not grant en masse deadline extensions. They have to be applied for individually. And yes, I suggest, as Jackie suggested you document the heck out of that to show why it is you were only this far along in the process and that you might not get to the finish line. I'm hoping, and some of the advocacy work that I'm going to be doing on behalf of employers directly to the commissioner, is that we get some reasonable response to these requests and that they don't initially go right into issuing AMPs to employers within the first month or two after not hitting these deadlines. Because I think if that's the case, she's going to be issuing a lot of AMPs because lots of folks still have tons of work to do to get through this very complex process as stipulated under this act. It's a good time to be a pay equity consultant. I'll say that.
Yes, but good luck finding one. All of them are very busy right now. And on the multiple plans, I think one of the key lessons I took out of the Treasury Board decision in particular was just how much evidence and how many experts there were involved in that case and how long it took. I mean, it took over a year for a decision. This is not a small process. So I think that scared a lot of employers off too. And I guess the one bone that the legislation threw for employers in this whole process is that at least in the committee, if the unions or the employee representatives aren't agreeing amongst themselves, the employer vote prevails. So in some cases, again, there can be some, I don't know if advantages is the right word, but at least there's an opportunity not to get bogged down the same way in different decisions from different union groups if they're all sort of going in different directions, that ultimately the employer's voice prevails. Yeah, I think one of the risks there is if the commissioner and team stand firm on these deadlines, she will be incentivizing employers to force these processes and force votes rather than do this in a collaborative way as the Act wants employers to do. If you're going to be firm to that September deadline, then employers are going to be left with no option but to start calling votes at the committee table to move things along, which, as you can imagine, is going to make a number of union people around that table not so happy. So I hope that the commissioner considers that reality when she contemplates deadline extensions for employers, because it would benefit everybody in the process to be reasonable in that context. Well, and we know that has fall-on labor relations effects, obviously, for many issues that do not relate to pay equity. So, what I've been saying to a lot of employers too is when you're going to the committee table, if you've got unions, make sure you're having discussions with them before you get to the table. So on key issues, try and get alignment before you're presenting the issue for the first time in the committee. And that may help to some extent that you can drive consensus, or at least if you know you're not going to have consensus, you know in advance of the committee meeting. Moving on to pay transparency, because this has been another topic that has really flared up in the past, month, I would say in particular, well, I guess 2 months. So just as a reminder of where we are, that back in 2020, the federal government changed the employment equity regulations and they added in these pay transparency obligations, which became due in the first reports that were filed by employers in their annual employment equity reports on June 1st, 2022. And this, for those of you who are at smaller federally regulated employers, this only applies to employers with 100 or more employees. And if we go to the next slide, what these pay transparency regulations are doing is adding in new categories of reporting for federally regulated employers with 100 more employees. And they're really trying to identify what I'll call the raw wage gaps based on the designated groups that are covered by the Employment Equity Act. So women, Indigenous peoples, individuals with disabilities, visible minorities are the current categories. And employers now have to submit this raw data showing the mean and median sort of gaps that are applicable to those groups. And they've always let us know that they were going to publish that information publicly. They were going to do it last year. The tool got delayed. So now they're in the process of releasing it at the moment, which is causing a lot of consternation to folks. And maybe if we can go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about that. And actually, even before I get there, one thing we saw that was interesting from the labor program back in the earlier fall, that they were reaching out to a lot of employers, sharing with them what they said were anomalies in their data, and asking employers if they wanted to correct or review that data before it got loaded into this tool, which is now going to be public in the imminently, I would say. It's still not quite sure exactly what was motivating the review of that data. They say it's because they were sort of running their own analysis over it and wanted to make sure that the data was correct. I think part of the challenge with the regs is that there's a lot of it's not entirely clear how all the data should be uploaded, for example, because if you work in payroll, you'll know someone may change a job mid-year, and that can create challenges when you're reporting on a full year and you're trying to report overtime pay, for example. Well, maybe they went from an overtime eligible role to an overtime ineligible role. So all of these issues were causing anomalies in the data. So some employers were resubmitting data, others were just confirming and clarifying how the data should be read. But that was kind of an initial flurry of activity back in September, early October. I think most employers now have sort of dealt with those issues. More recently, though, what we've seen is that ESDC has given presentations to employers. And Derrick, I'll let you jump in on this because I know you've been very involved, but giving employers presentations of what this tool is actually going to look like. And I think we are all quite surprised with the level of detail. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in this file since the very beginning. Maybe they've been talking pay transparency with stakeholders for about 4 or 5 years. I was pretty blown away when I saw the tool. They're calling it Equivision. And to your point, there will be an ability for a user in the public to pull pay transparency gap information for any employer by name along the 4 designated groups under the Employment Equity Act by the 14 employment equity occupational groupings or salary bands, if you will, within there. And you can do so in such a way that you compare your unemployer with up to, I think it's 2 other employers. That piece is brand new. We had never heard that was going to be an option. So when I saw it on the screen, it was quite surprising that you can compare employers and have that printout come up on the screen. The depth and breadth of the reporting is really quite striking. And my sense is it's a high-risk item for employers only because of that sheer volume of data that you can collect, you can pull up on the screen. It will be easy, I think, for somebody without the context behind the data misunderstanding what this might mean. So, for example, imagine a journalist pulls up company X and sees that there's a pay gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, in some area. You can probably cherry pick the data bits you want to tell your story. So my advice to employers is know your data well, have your communications ready to explain any anomalies that might exist in your data, because I think there are going to be questions. But the world is moving in this way around pay transparency. And when we've seen these tools rolled out in other countries, it can be quite alarming, and these can become front page stories. So certainly my advice is be ready for when this happens, because the depth and breadth of the data is really quite something.
I may have told you, Derrick, before, but there was on International Women's Day, there was a chat bot, is that the right word? That when any employer who's subject to the pay transparency reporting obligations in the UK, whenever they posted Happy International Women's Day on whatever social media platform, the bot automatically reposted their pay transparency data. So again, lots of opportunity to kind of misconstrue and misunderstand. This is raw wage gap. So it doesn't take into account sort of performance or history in job or any of those other factors. We know that more than anything, it's societal pressures that have resulted in the underrepresentation of these groups rather than any one specific employer's sort of fault, for lack of a better word. I think it's going to be a challenging time. Lots of questions are going to be asked. And so be prepared with those answers. Really quickly, we've been waiting for a while for this review of the Employment Equity Act. We're still anticipating that all of the designated groups that we mentioned are going to be revised, amongst other things. stay tuned. We still don't have an answer, but we expect that something will come at some point. Derrick, do you know more?
No, I mean, the act is terribly out of date. We've been lobbying the government for years to crack it open and modernize it. Many of our members who, themselves are very progressive employers are frankly uncomfortable with some of the outdated language that the act requires employers to use in terms of the way people are categorized. So we were very supportive of this initiative. We engaged fully in the consultation. We were supposed to have seen a report months and months ago. I understand the minister's office has received it, but there is yet nothing that they have shared with the public. I do hear from my sources that it's a pretty comprehensive report, which doesn't surprise me, given the folks who were running that committee, the outside experts they brought in, but we've seen nothing to date, which is too bad. So hopefully soon.
And over to Chris, please. Paid medical leave. What are we seeing?
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Derrick. Well, we are seeing both a lot and not so much as we sit here in late 2023, almost a year after paid medical leave was introduced. I'm going to go through this quickly because I think that most of the employers who have joined today are probably quite familiar with what the paid medical leave benefit is. In short, when we talk about paid medical leave, we're talking about the changes under the Canada Labour Code that introduced up to 10 paid days of leave for illness or injury and certain other things in December of 2022. So again, that's 10 paid days of medical leave each year. There are a variety of technical details that make the benefit contingent on certain periods of employment, and there's certain carryover mechanisms. But as it stands for our purposes, I think those are sort of commentary that really aren't what most employers are interested in today. Next slide, please. I think what most employers are very interested in today is how much their employees have been using paid medical leave over the course of the past year. We talked to a lot of clients about their experiences over the past 11 months or so. And I would say that 9 out of 10 of the federal employers we talked to have reported incredibly heavy use of paid medical leave days by their employees. And when I talk about incredibly heavy use, I'm talking about absenteeism jumping in some cases by over 1,000% year over year, talking about additional costs associated with granting medical leave to the millions or even tens of millions of dollars in some cases. So there's been a profound operational and cost impact already associated with this paid medical leave. I think partly as a consequence of that, there's been continued interest from the employer community in how paid medical leave under the code intersects with existing paid leave entitlements, whether under an employment contract or under a collective agreement. And we've seen a lot of activity on this front over the course of the past 12 months. Now, approximately a year ago, just before the leave came into force, we had the introduction of regulations and an IPG, an interpretive bulletin from the labor program in November 2022. The regulation said nothing really about interaction of benefits. And the IPG, although it ostensibly dealt specifically with interaction and of benefits and quote unquote stacking of the new leave on top of existing leaves, there wasn't much in there for employers. The IPG was ambiguous. It included a lot of language that, while purporting to say that employees couldn't double dip or stack benefits on top of each other, there's a lot of other language in there that seemed to go the other way. So after the IPG was released last year, there was quite furious lobbying by Derrick and the team at FETCO, as well as individual employers, for more clarity, and specifically from some action from the Minister and Labour program that would help prevent employees and unions from stacking the new 10 paid days under the code on top of existing generous paid leave entitlements. And some results were achieved based on that lobbying. In March of 2023, the Minister of Labour sent a letter to FETCO confirming that the new paid leave under the code was not intended to impact employers who already had leaves in place that were designed to cover illness or injury. There was also a revised IPG issued in April of 2023 that included some of the favorable language from the minister's letter. It said things like the new paid leave was not designed to impact federal employers who already provided generous leaves. But there were also some problems and ambiguities still in the revised IPG, including a change in language that really focused in on leaves that quote unquote serve the same purpose. And specifically, the revised IPG appeared to be saying that unless an existing leave under a collective agreement served exactly the same purpose as paid medical leave, exactly that purpose, it could not be counted towards an employee's statutory medical leave entitlement. So that's where we sat about halfway through the year. Next slide, please. And what's happened since then? Well, not a lot, at least of concrete developments in this area. We haven't had any additional clarity from the government in the form of a revised IPG or otherwise, despite numerous requests from the employer community for more clarity. We also have not yet had any concrete decisions come out of litigation processes that provide a lot more clarity. And so I think while we're in a better place, we've got a revised IPG and a minister's letter that does provide some support for an employer position against stacking of benefits. There's still a lack of clarity here. And in particular, there's a lack of clarity surrounding the interaction of leaves that are designed, these are leaves under a collective agreement or contract, that are designed to cover illness and injury, but they're not identical to the new paid medical leave. So I'm talking about things like short-term disability entitlements or personal day entitlements that are not just a floater holiday, but that are specifically designed, and it may say this in the collective agreement, specifically designed to cover employee absence due to illness and injury, but are also designed to cover other things. So in some ways, are much more generous than the paid medical leave entitlement under the code. But we don't have any clarity from the case law as to how to deal with these issues. And again, the government hasn't provided any new guidance in this area. There is one case that I wanted to flag for the group on the webinar today that provides some unfortunate guidance, I would say, around where the case law may go when it comes to medical leave. I want to be clear that this case that I'm about to mention, which is called CN and Teamsters, TCRC, CN Rail, does not deal with the paid medical leave under the code. It deals with the similar personal leave provisions under the code that were amended by the new paid medical leave. In any event, this is a decision involving CN Rail that came out in March of this year. It was an arbitration decision from arbitrator Stout out of Ontario, but this is, of course, a federally regulated workplace. In essence, what arbitrator Stout had to do was consider whether a personal day entitlement under the CN collective agreement served the same purpose as personal days under the code. And if it did, that would mean that the employer didn't need to provide both. The collective agreement entitlement would be enough, and the statutory entitlement would not be available to employees. Arbitrator Stout ultimately conducted a very narrow analysis into whether these leaves serve the same purpose. So that's the same language that's in the revised IPG that I've just mentioned, whether they serve the same purpose. And ultimately, he found that they did not, despite being personal leave entitlements that were similar in many respects. They did not serve the same purpose. And as a consequence of that, employees were entitled to both the Canada Labour Code, personal leave, and the pre-existing collective agreement leave. So they get to stack on top of each other. Now, there were some nuances in this case, which I think are really important and distinguishable, is against a lot of the issues that employers are facing with respect to paid medical leave. But still, this, I think, is not a helpful decision, certainly, for any employer who is facing litigation over the new paid medical leave entitlement. Next slide, please. And so where are we now when we look into the future? Well, as I've mentioned a couple of times, these questions are going to be sorted out through litigation, and there is a lot of litigation in the system around these issues. I think we at Faskens are aware of a number of major federal employers with large bargaining units who are facing grievances and are in the midst of labor arbitrations to deal with the interaction of existing collective agreement entitlements and the new paid medical leave. That said, we do not have any decisions yet, at least reported decisions that we're aware of. So still no guidance out of the ongoing litigation. I see a few main issues, though, that arbitrators are going to be struggling with as they try to work through these cases and render decisions on stacking of pre-existing entitlements and the new paid medical leave. One has to do with the role of an impact on bargained entitlements in the litigation. You know, a lot of these existing collective agreement entitlements that are designed to cover illness and injury were specifically negotiated by the parties, and often at the requests of unions, and often in exchange for generous trade-offs at the table. So it seems unfair, and I think arbitrators will find it to be unfair, at least some arbitrators will, that on one hand, we've got a negotiated entitlement that is very generous, often entered into very, very willingly by a union. And now that same union is coming and saying, well, that's not good enough, or actually isn't intended to cover illness and injury anymore. We want this new code leave too. I think arbitrators are going to struggle with that. And importantly, there is some case law out of Ontario that suggests that where that bargaining trade-off has occurred, employees should not be entitled to stack a statutory entitlement on top of a collective agreement entitlement. As I've already mentioned, a related part of the problem is that the personal days that many major federal employers have in their collective agreements are designed to cover illness plus more. These are not floater holidays that are sort of discounted in the interpretive guidance we have from the labor program thus far. And so it's an open question as to how an arbitrator is going to deal with a personal leave entitlement that is expressly designed to cover illness and injury, but also other types of leave. And then last but not least, I think that there's going to be a real practical consideration, a practical struggle in some cases at least, where arbitrators need to grapple with the serious operational and cost impacts that the addition of a new 10 days of paid leave on top of generous pre-existing leaves, how that's going to impact employers. You know, we're talking now about some employee groups who literally have months of paid leave per year. And that's in the face of labor shortages across the country, facing many federal employers, if not most federal employers, and real delicacy in the supply chain that we've witnessed in a number of ways over the course of the past 12 months. I think arbitrators, at least some arbitrators, will find these pressures compelling, and it may help tip the scales in employers' favor. Next slide, please. Okay, turning to a very different topic, and certainly much more under the radar topic. I wanted to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the new Modern Slavery Act that's going to impact both federal employers and provincial employers when it comes into force next year. First, what is the Modern Slavery Act? Well, when we refer to the Modern Slavery Act, we're talking to a piece of legislation that worked its way through Parliament, originating as a private member's bill, called the Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act, Bill S-211. This was a private member's bill that was passed with all party support in May of 2023. In essence, what Bill S-211 does is impose significant new annual public reporting requirements on Canadian businesses around force and child labor risks in their supply chains. It's not just in their own corporate operation, It also covers their supply chain, so risks that their suppliers may have, both in Canada and outside of Canada. The Act also creates new enforcement powers for government. Public Safety Canada imposes pretty significant financial penalties including at the board of directors level, and enables the government to seize goods that are suspected of being produced with forced and child labor at the border until an employer can essentially disprove that there was no forced or child labor used in the course of the production process. Next slide, please. So who's covered? Well, the short answer to that is most businesses of any size in Canada. All public companies are, please go back to that. Thanks. Okay, so all public companies listed on a stock exchange are covered by this new legislation. Many private businesses will be covered as well. And that's the specific requirements around private companies involve a combination of financial thresholds that are quite low, actually. So you've got to have 2 of 3 of the following criteria: at least 20 million in assets, 40 million in annual revenue, or an average of at least 250 employees. So a lot of medium-sized businesses will be captured within this legislation. Next slide, please. And what exactly does a covered business have to do? Well, in short, you need to provide an annual public report. This is a report that goes to government and needs to be posted on your corporate website that reports on the steps that the business has taken during the previous financial year to reduce the risk of child and forced labor in the supply chain. Again, this is both in the company's operation and in their suppliers' operations, both in Canada and abroad. So the report needs to include details on such things as business structure and activities in supply chain, any policies and due diligence processes that the company has in place, employee training around child and forced labor, compliance processes that have been put in place, ways in which the company measures its effectiveness in preventing forced and child labor. So quite a wide range of internal processes and mechanisms surrounding child and forced labor. And I just point out that for many Canadian companies, if not most Canadian companies, the need to deal with child and forced labor in their supply chain really is a new issue. So a lot of work is going to need to be done in this area for companies to become compliant. The fines are significant. Failure to comply with the legislation can result in fines on summary conviction of up to $250,000. That's for both individuals and businesses. And perhaps most importantly, this legislation is coming into force on January 1st of 2024, and the first report is going to need to be put out there in May 2024. So there's not a lot of time to comply. And last but not least, there is more change on the horizon. As I mentioned a couple times, Bill S-211 originated as a private member's bill, and it imposed a reporting and transparency obligation that I've just gone through that a lot of people didn't think was enough. So the NDP, for example, withdrew its support from the legislation because it wanted to see more. And partly as a reaction to that, the Liberal government in the budget earlier this year announced that it was going to impose due diligence legislation by 2024. As a consequence of that, we are looking at an additional layer of human rights obligations, international human rights obligations, being layered on top of the existing reporting obligation, probably sometime next year. And we don't know what the details of this new due diligence obligation are going to be. What we do know is that on top of the existing reporting obligation, I think companies are going to be required to take some sort of proactive steps to both identify human rights issues in their supply chain and then fix those human rights issues in their supply chain, as well as report on them, as we saw in Bill S-211. I think I'll leave it there. And Derrick, maybe I'll turn to you to chime in both on paid medical leave, which I skipped you there, and then also on Bill S-211. So why don't we start with paid medical leave?
Yeah, Chris, I thought your presentation on paid medical leave really was comprehensive and helpful because it really points to the fundamental problem that we've had throughout this entire process. Stéphane earlier on in this call talked about consultation, and it would have been so helpful had the government done some meaningful consultation on paid sick leave. It was clear that the government wanted to do something in this space when we were in the midst of the COVID global pandemic. There were clearly employees out there in some pockets of the economy that did not have adequate paid leave. But the problem, again, was the government kind of created its solution before it talks through in any meaningful way with stakeholders what that might mean. And we wish we could have had the opportunity to talk about some of the things that you mentioned in your presentation around stacking, around the greater rider benefit. The government, in particular this Minister of Labor, speaks effusively about his commitment to the negotiating table. He'll say things like, we believe in the table. We believe that's where the best deals are made. The reality is, in the federal private sector, many employers are large, many are heavily unionized. Most have crossed these bridges in negotiations with their unions, deals that came at a price when compromises were reached, where leave provisions were built into the collective agreements. And now, unfortunately, because they may not be called paid medical leave or paid sick leave, we have this really unfortunate situation around stacking. And we have fought aggressively for the past year and a half on this file to get some change made, first in the legislation, then in the regulations, and now in the interpretive material to accommodate this issue. Unsuccessfully, even though we have received commitments from the government numerous times that this was not what they intended and that they will, do their best to fix it. Yet not fixed. And unfortunately, what's going to happen is arbitrators are going to make these decisions. And my advocacy to the government has consistently been that is not the way we should be introducing change to the Canada Labor Code, where we're leaving it to arbitrators to sort it out. So, lots of work for lawyers. So happy for all you guys on this call, but not really great for developing good public policy. Because as you say, I have members who have seen 500, 1,000% increases in the amount of sick leave taken by employees in situations where they actually already had adequate leave provisions. So it's really quite striking. On the modern slavery piece, I'll say, again, it's back to consultation. So we're clearly moving this way in the world, which is a good thing, that we want to root out any examples of, forced labor or child labor in our supply chains. Who can argue that that's not a good idea? The problem is, we get this bill that came from the Senate without any consultation with stakeholders. It received political momentum and support. Obviously, nobody wanted to be seen to be voting against something like this. And we end up with a piece of legislation that I think most would argue is inadequate at best, hard to understand at worst. And I was on a call just about a month ago on this issue, and the department responsible for enforcing this legislation, which, as you say, comes into force in January with the reports due in May, have yet to share any material with employers from a guidance perspective on what the expectations are, what the reporting needs to look like, how the enforcement is going to be handled. That is clearly frustrating for the employer community. And then step two, we've started in that same meeting some discussions around what might come next around this mandatory due diligence. Again, not a bad thing, but my worry is we're going to go from 1 2-hour meeting with stakeholders to another piece of legislation in the new year that hasn't been fully thought through what that might mean and how it might be enforced and how employers might be able to, or organizations might be able to comply with it. So hopefully, I'm going to be optimistic here, there will be more discussions, because certainly there was good representation from around the country on the last call on this issue with good participation. And I think folks would like to participate more fully in what this solution might look like, because it's certainly concerning where we are right now.
Thanks very much, Derrick. That was really helpful.
Okay, thank you. And I think, Ross, are we moving on to pension? Okay, super. We'll jump straight into pension with Ross Gascho.
Thank you, and apologies that I am a little bit late. I was in another meeting, and as you probably saw me flapping my lips, I was doing a very short presentation at the end of it. Now, in some cultures, there's a saying that the fun begins when the pension lawyer speaks. I have yet to find that culture, but hopefully we can at least make this not painful for you. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about two things today. The first of these is the perpetual problem of unclaimed pensions. Next slide. These arise in a couple of situations. Many of you who have pension plans will know that you might have some members who you simply can't find. You don't have current contact information for them. Typically, these are people who have terminated employment and they are waiting to start their pension. In some cases, it might be retirees. That issue becomes particularly important once the member reaches age 71, because in order for the plan to continue to comply with Income Tax Act requirements, the pension has to go into pay or otherwise be transferred out of the plan before the end of the year in which the member attains age 71. So that's in an ongoing plan. There's a second scenario of what happens if you have unclaimed pensions in a terminated plan. Next slide. Next slide, please. Terminated plans present some extra problems. As you probably know, if you terminate a plan, you're going to settle all of the benefits, you're going to pay out all of the assets. As part of that process, if there are missing members, OSFI expects you to take steps to locate missing beneficiaries, but in some cases, they simply are not located. So there are some existing options for what to do if you have unlocated members. The first one is to purchase a deferred annuity for them, whether it's defined benefit or defined contribution. The issue with purchasing a deferred annuity is, will an insurer sell it to you? For example, you may not have enough information about the individual in order for the insurer to be willing to make the sale. More expensive would be to pay into court on application or seek the advice and direction of the court, so that at least you have some advice as to what you should do with this money, and that can be very helpful in dealing with the regulator. But in some cases, plans are terminated, and the only assets that are remaining are for unlocated members, and those plans continue to exist solely because of those members and the assets sitting there. So nobody is able to carry on with their lives. Next slide. The federal jurisdiction is one of the few in Canada in which the regulators have tried to deal with the issue. And currently, under the Pension Benefits Standards Act, it's theoretically possible for the administrator of a plan to transfer the pension value to what it calls a designated entity. That's subject to obtaining approval from OSFI, and then it's up to the designated entity to hold on to the value of the pension. And after a certain period of time, if it's still unclaimed, then the value transfers to the Crown, and unfortunately, the member loses the right to claim that amount. The difficulty with that regime is that no entity has been designated. When that system came in, it was thought that the major banks might be able to do it, but that has not proved to be the case. So we're now into what is the next phase of that. Next slide. Under the new framework, the Bank of Canada will be the designated entity. We need the regulation to do that, but that's what we're being told. And again, the Superintendent of Financial Institutions will need to approve a request to transfer to the Bank of Canada unless the transfer otherwise meets what will be the superintendent's published conditions. The Bank of Canada will receive the assets that relate to the member's entitlement, and that might be less than 100% of the value of that entitlement. So, for example, in the case of a terminated plan where there wasn't enough money, or in the case of a negotiated contribution plan where payouts might be less than 100% of entitlement, the bank is just going to receive whatever the amount is, and that's going to be the Bank of Canada's liability to the member, not the full amount. Next slide. And once the transfer is made to the Bank of Canada, the legislation says that it satisfies the plan's obligation to provide the benefit. It doesn't say discharges. We had hoped for language that say it would discharge us. The administrator doesn't, but it does satisfy the obligation. And in addition to the member, there will be other people who can make the claim to the Bank of Canada. The member's power of attorney in the case of incapacity, a state trustee in the case of a deceased member, and likewise survivor or designated beneficiary. So that's the new framework. It's good news going forward, and let's hope they make it operative soon. Next slide. The next is not unique to federal plans, but for anyone who has a defined contribution pension plan, some very good news about what happens if you make a contribution error. Next slide. The Income Tax Act regime has been around for about 35 years, and it contemplates both under contributions and over contributions, but in somewhat unsatisfactory ways. If you inadvertently or a member somehow doesn't make the required contribution, the solution is essentially just make the required contribution. The problem is that there are caps on how much can be contributed. Every year, as you know, there is a limit on how much can be contributed on behalf of a member to a DC plan. That limit stays in place even if you're trying to correct for prior errors. And the result is that when employers are correcting, they end up spreading contributions over years so that the total contributions, both for the past and the present, don't exceed the limit. And likewise, they can't do it for everybody. You can't contribute for someone who isn't an employee or for someone who's more than age 71. So, and you then have to amend the plan to provide for the catch-up. Next slide. So the new framework is that the Income Tax Act now has something called a permitted corrective contribution. And that's where you have an error in either failing to enroll someone or to make a required contribution. If that's the case, you can go back up to 10 years from the year of the correcting contribution to correct it. There are some limitations around what your plan has to be. Essentially, it needs to be a broad-based defined contribution plan. And the permitted corrective contribution is either the missed contributions plus any investment income or 150% of the year's money purchase limit. So for 2023, it's about $46,000. And that $46,000 is reduced if there were any prior permitted corrective contributions. That's a big change. It will make administrators' lives, frankly, a whole lot easier. Next slide. Unlike the old system, there's no plan amendment required. The contributions are deductible in the year that they're paid. They are not PA'd, but you do have to file an information return. There's a prescribed form to do it, and the changes go back all the way to January 1 of 2021. Next slide. The 150% limit does not reset. It's lifetime for someone while they're in the plan, but it is going to increase over time because it's tied to the money purchase limit. One significant exclusion from it is that it only applies in respect of required contributions. So to the extent that a member made a contribution that didn't attract an employer match, it's not considered to be a required contribution, and the regime doesn't apply. We go back to the old system and how under contributions were dealt with there. Next slide. And then the next issue is, well, what happens if we over contribute? And frankly, that has been the harder one for most employers. If you over contribute to a plan, either more than the money purchase limit or more than what the plan says, you've created two problems. One is that the contributions are wrong, and that's an offense under the Act. And the second is that the plan isn't being administered as it's currently registered. The result is that the plan's registration can be revoked by the CRA. The good news is that the Income Tax Act already contemplates that refunds of overcontributions to prevent revocation of registration are permissible. Next slide. The second scenario that the Income Tax Act already contemplates is a refund of contributions due to a reasonable error. The payment has to be made back to the original contributor, and it has to be made by the end of the year in which the error occurred. Next slide. So those two things together prove to be rather tight because a lot of situations didn't fall within them. The employer didn't need CRA's approval in order to proceed, but OSFI or whoever the pension standards regulator would typically have their own rules in place. So there was a dual process. You'll still need to engage with the pension regulator. Next slide. Under the new framework, the Income Tax Act now has something called a pension adjustment correction. And that is when we are contributing withdrawing contributions in order to avoid the revocation of registration of the plan. Again, like under contributions, you can go back for 10 years and the investment income as well as the contribution itself can be withdrawn. The administrative mechanism for doing it is to report a pension adjustment reversal. So for example, if the overcontribution was $10,000, the member had a pension adjustment on that. Now, when we withdraw the money, the pension adjustment is reversed and the individual's RRSP is restored. File the notification to the CRA within 60 days of the end of the quarter, and you are done. A much easier system, and kudos to both the Department of Finance and the CRA for all of the work that they put into this. And that ends the pension pain points for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ross. I know where to find you. It sounds complicated, but thanks for giving us the update. We're going to quickly close it out now with accessibility, and just want to flag more than anything for employers sort of what we're seeing and what's on the horizon. This legislation is structured in a bit of a challenging way where there are different rules that apply based on the type of employer you are. I won't get into the details, won't get into the structure, but at a really high level, what this legislation does is it creates essentially a regime under which we're going to see the development of lots of standards. And there's some basic provisions. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see, so the focus of the focus of it really is to build accessibility standards in a whole wide range of areas. And as I'll get Derrick to say or to tell us about in a moment, we're starting to see some of those come through. In the next slide, so as I mentioned, different standards, different type of employers. Next slide. Sorry, I'm rushing through here, and I know we've got a couple more minutes, but I want to get to the important part. So, what employers had to do, or many employers had to do, some employers will have to do this coming year, is develop an initial accessibility plan. And that's a fairly sort of rudimentary activity in the grand scheme of things. It's sort of setting the framework for how employers will flush out their more significant accessibility standards or strategy as the standards are unveiled and established in regulations in the coming years, which we anticipate will happen over the next decade, really, and beyond. This past week, we've seen at least 2 employers who have had inquiries about the status of their initial accessibility plans. So we're actually starting to see enforcement action on this now, which is quite surprising. I thought that we really wouldn't see much in the way of enforcement action for at least another year or so. But we're already getting employers coming to us saying that they've been asked to produce copies of their initial accessibility plans. And so I would just flag that for you. If you haven't already done it, be prepared for that phone call to come in, because it very well may do shortly. Employers also have to have feedback mechanisms developed as part of that. And there are going to be, again, ongoing obligations. You're going to have to update your plans and then report on those updates in the coming years. But Derrick, I want to turn it over to you now quickly to talk about what we're seeing in terms of new standards that are being released for comment and review, because I know that FETCO was involved in commenting on the most recent employment standard.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. The government has stood up a new department, if you will, called Accessibility Standards Canada. And the primary objective of that organization is to draft the standards that the government might consider implementing under the Act. So they have just closed a consultation on a draft employment standard, which we had provided some comment on. And the next one up, for which comments are due, I believe, next month, is around emergency measures. There's a lot of sort of occupational health and safety stuff in there. So we're going to go through that one as well. What I would say is that it's important that organizations engage in these processes, because even though it seems a long ways out, the work they're doing now is really going to inform what comes next when the standards get developed. And it's going to be more difficult for us to say later down the road, hey, you didn't talk to us, when they have actually been having a pretty detailed process. And I will give the government some credit here, because I do criticize them a lot on the consultation front. They've done a lot of consultation on accessibility. So there's lots of opportunities for us to engage, and I certainly encourage anybody on the line to do that and engage in any way that you can to have your voice heard in the way these things roll out.
Yeah, we're really seeing that it's covering a whole host of, much like we did with the Accessibility Act in Ontario, the AODA, we're seeing the employment standard in particular has a lot to it. So there's training, there's policies, there's practices. It's really intended to cover the sort of the life cycle of the employment relationship, I think is how they put it. So certainly going to have implications for employers, and making sure that that's done in a way that makes sense and sort of pushes forward changes that will be helpful without unduly sort of impairing the natural flow of things.
Well, and one of the challenges is this topic is so cross-functional, right? There isn't one department necessarily in your organization that will lead in this space. So some advice that I would give any organization out there is to find champions in your organization to lead this work, because of its cross-functional nature. Otherwise, you may miss things.
You're absolutely right, because it often ends up on HR desk, but then it involves IT, and it involves the building facilities folks, and and it involves the recruitment, and so it really brings in a lot of things. That's a really good point. With that, I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you so much, first and foremost, Derrick, for joining us today. We really appreciate the sort of additional context that you bring to these presentations. The materials will be sent out afterward if anyone would like to share them. Thank you also to my co-presenters and to everyone who joined us, obviously. We have another presentation coming up this week. It's going to be on collective bargaining. It's going to be a really great panel, folks from BC, Quebec, and Ontario, sharing what we're seeing in happening in bargaining across federal but also provincial sectors. So please join us on Friday from 2 to 3:30. If you haven't signed up already, you can do so on the Fasken webpage at Fasken Institute. So thank you again, everyone.